Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the name and face of a man who was still almost ubiquitous in all the countries of the socialist bloc decades after his death. This was how he was known intimately to at least 3 generations of people in Eastern Europe, and even 5 in the Soviet Union. You probably wouldn't recognize him in this photo. Yet this is probably what he looked like at the beginning of perhaps the most important day of his life, November 7th, 1917, when the communists under his leadership overthrew the Russian government and began more than 70 years of their dictatorship in the greatest country in the world. In the days leading up to the revolution, Lenin, on the instructions of the Central Committee of his Bolshevik party, hid in hiding. For one thing, he was afraid of being arrested, and besides, the other party leaders did not much desire his company. This was because of his short-tempered and intolerant nature. However, on the night of the 7th of November, Lenin's impatience and anger that nothing was still happening came to a head. Without the consent of the others, accompanied only by a bodyguard, he got on a tram in disguise and then walked to his headquarters in Smolny. He arrives shortly before midnight and immediately begins to plan his steps for the next day. The day when the political map of the world is about to be fundamentally changed. Lenin was his pseudonym, which he never revealed why he chose it. His maiden name was Ulyanov, and his family tree was a truly colorful mix. There were Russian, Chuvash and Jewish, as well as German, Swedish and Mongolian genes. The key events of Vladimir's adolescence took place between his 15th and 17th years. First, his father died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage. A respected high school principal whose democratic views significantly influenced all 6 of his children who lived to adulthood. In 1887, Lenin's older brother Alexander, whom Vladimir admired greatly, was executed for preparing the assassination of the Tsar. It was at this time that the views of an intelligent young man who had finished high school with a gold medal for outstanding achievement and gone on to the law faculty of Kazan University became very radicalized. Here we need to take a little detour and remind ourselves what Russia was like at that time. Compared to Western Europe, which was modernizing, limiting the power of its monarchs and bringing the first advances of democracy, it was completely medieval. Above, an all-powerful Tsar, rich nobility, landlords and a rapidly enriching bourgeoisie, and below, millions of desperate landless rural people and an army of urban workers, often working in utterly inhuman conditions. It is no wonder that it is here that Marx's ideas about class struggle, revolution, and the subsequent rule of those who suffer most have found many followers. Lenin became acquainted with them in the late 1880s. During the 1990s, he then became close to Russian revolutionary circles, while at the same time coming under the radar of the Tsarist police. He has to leave school, and for the first time is ordered to leave. Later, he travels abroad, meets Marxists in Western countries, and prints an illegal newspaper. For this, he was arrested, imprisoned, and in 1897 sent into exile for 3 years in Siberia, about 600 kilometers from the Mongolian border. After a year, the authorities allow his partner from revolutionary circles, the then 29-year-old Nadezhda Krupskaya, who was arrested together with him, to visit him. The condition is that they get married. This would happen in July 1898, and Krupska would remain by his side until his death. As a tolerant partner, she would at one time even be willing to accept the model of a 3-way marriage with Lenin's mistress, Ines Armand. She will also be his personal secretary and, at the end of his life, his nurse. Lenin returned from exile in 1900 and spent practically the entire period until 1917 in exile. Paris, London, Geneva. In 1903, at a congress in Brussels, he splits the Social Democratic Party by forming a faction of Bolsheviks, a non-conciliatory wing that promotes a hard class struggle by any means necessary. It is from them that the all-powerful Communist Party will emerge after the revolution. 2 years later, in 1905, the first Russian Revolution comes after the great protests in which Tsarist soldiers and policemen kill hundreds of people in St. Petersburg. After it, Tsar Nicholas II must give up his unlimited power and impose unprecedented civil liberties on Russia. Most of the public is satisfied, but Lenin is not. His dream revolution looks very different. The situation in Russia stabilizes in the following years, but then comes 1914 and the First World War. This hits poor and underdeveloped Russia even more horribly than other countries. 2 million dead at the front, poverty and hunger in the Russian cities. In St. Petersburg, there are 40-hour waits outside grocery stores. Suddenly, the socialists have an argument that even those who would otherwise not pay attention to them can hear. We will end the war. It all starts subtly. In February 1917, spontaneous riots overthrow the Tsar and install a provisional government at the head of the country. Virtually all the revolutionaries, including Lenin, are in exile at the time, reading the news from Russia in disbelief. That it happened completely without us? So Lenin goes back to Petrograd in April 1917, and everything is fast approaching the decisive clash that will take place on November 7th. On that day, Lenin's Bolsheviks gradually gained control of all key places in the capital, St. Petersburg. It goes smoothly, with little support for the government. The main thing, the attack on the government headquarters, the Winter Palace, doesn't start until night. This is how the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein portrayed him heroically in his 1928 film. In reality, it was far less epic. Most of the Winter Palace defense surrendered without a fight, with no casualties on their side. On the revolutionary side, 6. Many people in the city didn't even notice that a coup had taken place. They were used to the shooting. Some were walking around town, some were spending the evening at the theater. Things don't go so smoothly in other places. Moscow, tough fighting and 5,000 dead. Siberia, protests and riots. A number of regions with national minorities declare autonomy or secede from Russia. But it doesn't change the fact that the Bolsheviks took over the biggest country in the world. Lenin becomes chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, the de facto head of the government, and his decrees changed life in the country from the ground up. The most famous are the Decree of Peace ending the war and the Decree on Land, which distributed land from the nobility, the church and landlords to poor peasants. But there are other steps coming too. First of all, the dissolution of the legally elected parliament, in which the Bolsheviks had barely a quarter of the seats. This definitively establishes one-party rule in Russia. And further, the introduction of censorship, the prosecution of political opponents and their condemnation by revolutionary tribunals, the creation of a brutal secret police, then called the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution. And in July 1918, the execution of the Tsar, his wife, 5 children and servants, in a small basement room of a house in Ekaterinburg. All of this arouses resentment. In August 1918, an assassination attempt is made on Lenin. Fanny Kaplan, a 28-year-old socialist from a rival party, hits him in the shoulder, collarbone and neck with her shots. She is arrested and executed, but Lenin survives. But it will give him an excuse to unleash what is now called the Red Terror. Opponents of the Bolsheviks are suddenly being arrested and executed indiscriminately, but by the thousands. The transformation of Vladimir Lenin from a theoretician of the socialist revolution into a leader responsible for millions of wasted human lives is complete.